This story happened when I was about 18. I had just graduated and was looking for a job in the city so I could move from my family home into a new place with my then boyfriend. I had applied everywhere, but with no response. When finally one day I get a call from a company whose ad I had answered, and they offered me an interview. The job seemed to be one of those promotions companies. You know, those door-to-door salesmen, or the guys with the little booths in the middle of a shopping center selling crappy skin products or paintball vouchers. Although the ad was intentionally vague. I went along to the interview, which was in an office on a busy street, just out of the city. So not dodgy looking or anything. No bad vibes so far. I had a one-on-one interview with a man named John. He was a huge man with dreads. He was built like a linebacker, but he was nice and seemed very positive about my meager experience. I had been working casually while I was in school, but I did have enthusiasm, which I think he liked. John explained that the successful applicants would be called back and would all go together in a minibus to the company's warehouse to look at the products and get a better idea of what sort of things we would be selling. Sounds good. The interview went well, and I got a call back for the following week. So I arrive at the office once again and sit in the waiting area with 20 other people of various ages. After a while, John and another man came into the room and told everyone, "We're just about ready to go. We just need to quickly speak with Monroe before we set off." Monroe is my name. I was a bit confused, but I figured there must have been a detail they had to check with me about. And I followed them into a meeting room. John introduces the other man as Steve, and says something about how he was very impressed by my interview last week, blah blah blah. He then says, "So, we're gonna go to the warehouse now. Let's go." At this point, I look up and realized that all the other people who were in the room were now gone. Alarm bells were going off now in my head. But I reasoned that maybe everyone just went outside to go wait for the bus, so I make to follow them. But as I was leaving the building, John says, "You're going to be going in Steve's car today," and directs me to the car parked out front. The alarm bells were getting louder now, but I keep walking. We reach the car. Then John says, "You hop in the back. We'll ride in the front." I freeze. I suddenly realized they never actually told me where the warehouse was. And most cars have the ability to turn on the child lock for the back doors. Suddenly a tram that was passing by jolts me back to reality. Thank you for the offer, but I don't think I can do this job." John gets visibly annoyed and says something like, "Well, if you didn't think you could do it, then why'd you come here?" And I nervously replied something like, "I thought I could, but I actually can't. Sorry. Goodbye." I then speedwalked all the way over to where the tram was just about to leave. I hop on, and I cry all the way back to my boyfriend's house. I have no idea what those men's intentions were for me, and why I was singled out. I had my boyfriend look up their company name. He worked for a large bank at the time, and he was able to find them. They were a subsidiary for another company who had major debt problems. It makes me wonder if they were running some kind of human trafficking ring or something. I felt I made the right decision by leaving. He wasn't my blood uncle. He was my biological aunt's brother-in-law. My mom used to date sketchy guys when I was a teenager. I didn't live with her much because she was a horrible role model. So my grandmother raised me for a big chunk of my life, and I am thankful for that because she taught me many values and how to be a lady. I later moved in with my father and stepmother and my half-siblings when I was around 15, and I had a wonderful life with them. But let's rewind the clock to when I was 14. At the time, I lived with my mother and her sleazy boyfriend named Dale. We were on the second story of a duplex. Her boyfriend had this friend who would come over occasionally, who looked just like the white guy from Jerky Boys. Same hair too. He always creeped me out because he kept staring at me, and I would always catch him in the act. My aunt lived down the block, and I would visit her quite frequently because she was one of those cool aunts. She was in her 20s, super fun, and had this 1969 Firebird convertible that she would drive around in and blast rock music. When I would visit her house, I would sometimes run into her brother-in-law. His name was Jeff, Uncle Jeff. He was renting out her basement. I kinda thought he was weird, but an okay guy. So one night at around 11:30, I was home by myself when I get a knock on the door. Our door had a square glass panel toward the top that was painted over, with a small peephole scratched into it. When I looked through, I could see that it was Jeff on the other side. I opened the door. "Oh, hey Jeff, what's up? Hey, is your mom or Dale home?" "No, mom's at work, and I don't know where Dale is." He then asked me to come downstairs because he wanted to talk to me. This didn't raise any red flags because I considered him family. I was also pretty timid and didn't like saying no to people, especially adults. So I follow him downstairs to the front porch. I see his car is parked and still running with the headlights on. Sitting in the passenger seat with the window rolled down was the other creepy guy I alluded to earlier, Jerky Boy. I paused. What's he doing here?" Hey, relax. We just want to talk. We wanted to ask you something." He began to gently guide me toward the car. My adrenaline began pumping, and all of a sudden, I felt something wasn't right. I stopped and pulled back a little, trying my best not to look scared. Jeff kept talking sweetly, running his finger up my shoulder to fix my spaghetti strap. "Oh, it's okay. Just come closer to me. There's no reason to be afraid." I pulled away politely and said, "Whatever it is you need to ask me, you can ask me right here." He kept trying to convince me just to come to the car and said that if I was too scared, I could just stand in front of the headlights. The second he said that, my stomach did a leap and my whole body started to feel electrically charged because I knew if I stood in front of the headlights, I would not be able to see, making it easy for one of them to grab me. At that very moment, I knew I was in a dangerous situation, so I started acting ditzy and dumb because I was afraid to let them know that I was onto them and that they were doing something that would land them in prison. And he would just grab me right then and there, cover my mouth, and drag me into the car so that I couldn't tell anyone. So I started to playfully joke around and said that I wasn't wearing shoes and that I didn't want to step in dog shit. I could see that Jerky Boy was now starting to come out of his car. Then I sprinted back upstairs, running as fast as I could and locking the door behind me. I was shaking so bad. Not a minute later, Jerky Boy is knocking on the door, and he's looking through the makeshift peephole. He starts saying that he needs to talk to my mom's boyfriend, Dale. I say that he's not here, so he stops knocking, but I don't hear him descending the stairs. 30 seconds after that, Jeff comes up and knocks, and is talking to me through the door, saying that he needed to talk to Dale, and then tries opening the door. However, it's locked. For the third time, I repeat that Dale wasn't there. "Oh, I'm sorry if we scared you, sweetheart. We just wanted to talk to you." That was bullshit. I was afraid that they were going to try to kick the door in, so I decided that I was going to try and sneak out the back. I walked toward the back door. And thank God I looked out the window first, because I saw the silhouette of Jerky Boy standing downstairs at the back door. So now, Jeff was at the front door, trying to sweet-talk me, and his friend was waiting out back. I know what you're probably thinking. Call the cops. I don't know why I didn't. I know it's stupid. I think it was because I was so naive and timid. Jeff was my uncle after all. I was also questioning myself and my own judgments, because Jeff kept reassuring me at the front door. So I returned to the front door, and Jeff is still there, telling me that he felt horrible for scaring me. I then tell him, trying my best to disguise any hint of fear in my voice, that everything was okay, and that I was so sorry that I got scared. I tried my best to placate him and convince him that I believed what he told me. They eventually left, and once the coast was clear, I snuck out and ran to a friend's house. I didn't tell them anything about what happened. I just said that I was scared and wanted to stay there until my mom got home. I did tell my mother about what happened, but nothing ever came of it. And thankfully I moved into my dad's house 45 miles away 3 months later. I never saw those two men again. When I was in elementary school, my parents worked long hours and wouldn't get off until it was very late in the day. I would stay in an after-school program that took place in our cafeteria. Not because I had to, but because it was more conducive with my parents' schedule. It usually consisted of doing homework and playing board games until around 5 p.m. Even then, some kids would be waiting around the pickup area for an hour or even more, and I would join them while a chaperone waited with us. I was almost always the last kid to be picked up, so whenever I would leave, so would the assigned chaperone. One day, the chaperone really needed to use the restroom. That day we were the last ones in the pickup area. He told me not to leave until he got back. So I was sitting there on the ground against the wall, when suddenly, a car pulled up. A bearded man in a flannel shirt and dark sunglasses lowered the passenger window and said, "Come on, let's go. Your dad can't pick you up today. I'm your uncle." I just sat there gripping my backpack, staring at him, completely frozen. I didn't recognize him, and I was scared, so I didn't say anything. I was confused and I didn't know what to do. Could this guy really be my uncle? Had something happened to my dad? The man seemed to get impatient, and with a stern voice, he said, "Get in the car now. Your dad got hurt. We need to go see him. Hurry." I still sat there, not moving. It was then that the chaperone returned, and as soon as he appeared, the car sped off. The chaperone wasn't able to get the license plate number and told my parents about it when they came to pick me up. From that day on, the school took extra precautions and assigned more chaperones to watch the children after school, which was a good thing. But I still wonder what would have happened if I believed him and naively went with him. He also must have been watching us for some time, because he showed up as soon as the chaperone left. This could have easily happened to a student who was younger than me, who wouldn't have known better. It's sad, but not everyone knows about stranger danger. Just watch your local news. When I was 15 years old, my great-uncle passed away due to a sudden heart attack. My father and I had to clean out his house since no one else in the family could do it. My uncle was loved by all of us and was one of the nicest guys you could ever meet. My father was broken up about losing him, but the job had to be done. His house was very neat and well organized, so we would be done in a day or two at most. I remember as a kid, we would play over at his house sometimes, whenever my parents had to work. He would allow us to play anywhere in the house, except for the attic. He made it very clear to us that going up and down the ladder to the attic was very dangerous. Therefore, we never went up there, and I never thought anything of it. Even though he would go up there sometimes for about 30 minutes, then come back down, never actually bringing anything with him or taking anything up there. While we were cleaning, I decided to finally go up to the attic just to see what was up there. It was completely empty, except for 2 boxes that were tucked away in a corner. Thinking nothing of it, I picked up the dusty boxes and took them downstairs to the living room. I opened them expecting to see some old papers because the boxes were so light. Instead, what I found were pictures. Hundreds and hundreds of photos of 3 different women. From all the angles, you could clearly tell they didn't know they were being photographed. He had pictures from daytime to night and from multiple locations. In some they were undressed, and in others they were doing everyday things like cleaning and cooking. My heart started to beat faster and faster. Looking closer, I realized one of the women was his wife, who had passed away several years earlier. I looked on the back of the pictures, and they were named. I didn't want to freak my family out without knowing what exactly I was looking at. So out of curiosity, I found the other 2 names of the women on Facebook. I was glad to find out that they were alive and okay. Once finding that out, I showed the pictures to my father, and he was just as shocked as I was. He took the boxes, and I've never seen them again, and we never spoke of it. Still, I find myself wondering why he had those pictures, and if he took them himself or had someone else take them. I loved my great-uncle very much, and I couldn't imagine him being anything less than a stand-up guy. I don't know what to make of this, to be honest. I know this may not seem like a very scary story, but it most certainly freaked my father and I out pretty bad. Before I begin, I'm from Russia. My English isn't that great, but I'll try my best. I was really struggling on whether or not I wanted to share this story because I am still disturbed and shaken up to this day. I grew up in a wealthy family. Both of my parents had enough money to get me into the best schools in Russia, and I remember going to many places during the summer breaks, and to this day, those are still my fondest memories. My parents had steady jobs, and they were mostly happy together. However, my father was never very fond of my mother's side of the family, especially my uncle and both of my grandparents. For whatever reason, they didn't get along with my dad. My mom tried pleasing everyone, lending them money, even though they would never pay her back. However, things got to a point where they turned on each other. My uncle really wanted my grandparents' house, even though he already had a huge house of his own. However, the house would go to my mother after they passed away, to square off any debts. He didn't really like this arrangement, but couldn't do anything about it. As fate would have it, both of my grandparents died in the same year. My grandfather had a condition where his left side was completely paralyzed. He slipped into a coma for a week before he woke up. His last words to this day have resonated with me. He told my uncle that he never got what he wanted because he was a greedy bastard. A couple of hours later, my grandfather passed away. My grandmother's health deteriorated not long after that. My mother became very depressed after this and was diagnosed with breast cancer the next year. Thankfully, she is still alive today, but she is not the same as she used to be. She had to stop going to work because she couldn't handle the stress. My father tried opening up a new business because he made the mistake of listening to my cousin. My father was hesitant at first, but my mother convinced him to do it. Since she didn't have a job, this could be something that she could occupy her time with. My father invested a lot of money into opening up this new business. My cousin was also heavily involved and influenced my father in all his investments. By the time he finalized everything, our financial future depended on this business being successful. He was risking a lot. By this time I was in high school, while my sister was going to college. This was when the worst possible thing happened to my family. The business that my father invested so much money into did not go as planned, and he ended up closing it down. He tried selling it off, but nobody bought it for the longest time. We were now broke and asking loan sharks for money. We couldn't go anywhere. I was too embarrassed to tell my friends or anyone else for some reason. While all this was happening, my uncle had moved into my grandparents' house and would ignore my mom's calls, even though my grandparents' will clearly stated the house belonged to my mother. My uncle built a fence so that nobody could trespass. The police were no help at all, and we had no money to hire someone to help us move him out of there, and we also couldn't fight him in court. As bad as things were, the worst was yet to come. We ended up being evicted from our house, unable to pay our mortgage with most of our things now belonging to the loan sharks. I spent an entire week homeless in the winter with my parents, and if you know anything about Russia, it gets rather cold there. These were the most painful days of my life. We ended up staying at a shelter. My mother tried ending her own life a couple of times, but we would always intervene. No one wanted to help my family. Until one day I got a call from a childhood friend. Her name was Olga. Her family agreed to take me in until my parents got back on their feet. Olga's father had a close friend who was a lawyer and said that he would look into the case regarding my grandparents' house. My mother was the rightful owner, but the Russian police would not lift a finger until they had a court order, which would cost money, which is something we didn't have. That's how things work over here. For the next 6 months, I stayed at Olga's place, and we grew closer than ever, and even started dating. During this time, I eventually went back to school. The lawyer told my parents that he would be able to repossess my grandparents' house. On the day of the hearing, it took the judge 2 seconds after reviewing my grandfather's will. But my uncle still refused to cooperate, which was a big mistake. Here in Russia, the police do not mess around. I remember watching him being dragged through the snow, beaten until he was unconscious, and then thrown into the back of a squad car. Now you might think that this is where things get better, but as soon as my uncle was out of jail, he tried everything in his power to make us homeless again. He hired some people to break in and rob us. Rocks would be thrown at our windows, and we would be harassed in public. We tried reporting him, but we had no proof. My grandparents' house was very isolated, and not too many people were passing by, which made it an easy target. During a walk, my sister was almost assaulted by some men, but thankfully, she was able to get away. Once my father was financially stable again, he hired a private detective to monitor our house. They captured a photo of my uncle breaking into our house. My guess is that he ran out of money to hire people to do it for him. We reported this to the police and showed them the photos. He was charged with breaking and entering, among many other things, and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. My cousins and my aunt tried to contact us and would leave messages on our answering machine, calling us the worst names possible and that we should have died in the freezing cold, and that someday we are going to pay for everything that we did. But eventually they stopped reaching out to us. Thank God for that. Since the events of this story, I have finished college and was able to start a successful business with some friends of mine, and I'm doing well for myself. I just hope that whenever my uncle gets out of prison, he doesn't try to start anything with my family again. One morning, when I was in elementary school, probably 3rd or 4th grade, I was awoken by my mom in a rush. She had overslept, and since she always woke me up in the mornings, this meant that I too had overslept. and now there was no way I would be ready in time to catch the bus. My school started at 8 a.m., and the bus pickup time was around 7 o'clock, but it was already 6:40, and I was still in my pajamas, and I hadn't even had breakfast yet. So my mom decided that today, she would just tell the bus driver to go ahead, and she would take me to school that day, which would give me plenty of time to get ready. So I'm sitting there in the dining room, eating breakfast, still in my pajamas, and it's now around 6:50. We hear the bus pull up, about 10 minutes earlier than usual. My mom peeks her head out of the door into the foggy morning and waves the bus on. She closes the door and comes back inside, but the bus does not pull away. A short time later, we hear a knock at the door. My mom opens it and finds a man in a bus driver's uniform. He explains that he's a substitute driver because the regular guy called in sick. He tells my mom he knows he's a few minutes early, explaining that he wanted an early start since he didn't know the route too well. My mom explains to him that she's going to take me to school herself since we had woke up late. The man gets visibly upset and says that he could wait for a few minutes since he's already running ahead of schedule. My mom insists and says that I won't be ready to go in a few minutes and tells him to go on ahead. I remember that the man seemed angry about this, but turned around, got back on the bus, and left. I returned to eating my breakfast, and I still don't have my school clothes on at this point. But at 7 a.m. sharp, another bus pulls up to my house. Mom thought it was weird and goes outside to talk to them. She comes back inside, looking absolutely terrified, but doesn't say anything about it and just tells me to finish up and start getting ready for school. At the time, I didn't know what happened, but Mom would end up explaining a few years later. When she went to the second bus, she found that it was being driven by the regular bus driver, and it was full of the other kids that are usually on my route. The other bus was empty, by the way. My mom asked the driver about the substitute and about him calling in sick. "I never called in sick. There's no substitute driver on my route," he said. The driver immediately called dispatch in a panic and told my mom to go back inside and call the police to report this incident, which she did without me knowing. There was absolutely no one covering for my bus driver that day. Whoever it was most likely a kidnapper who had targeted me. I never heard anything about it again, or even if someone else had been abducted by this mysterious fake bus driver. But chances are, if my mother hadn't overslept that day, I would have never made it to school or back home. This happened in the 90s. When I was growing up, my mom was a horrible addict. She barely took care of me as a kid. At the time of this incident, I was around 6 or 7 years old, so my awareness and understanding of things may not totally make sense. One night, my mother and I were on a car ride. I wasn't sure where we were going, but it was late at night. Looking back now, I assume it was very late because there weren't many other cars on the road, and I was resting in the back seat. I don't even remember getting into the car. My mom drove up to some sketchy house and left me in the back seat for what felt like forever. Suddenly, the car door swung open, and someone violently grabbed me by my arm and yanked me out of the car. I began screaming and crying until the man looked me in my eyes and said, "Be quiet, don't try to run, or I'll kill you." He had a scruffy beard, and he looked absolutely insane. I was scared to death, so I listened. He held me tight by my arm, shut the car door, and walked with me down the street. I looked back at the house my mom was in, hoping that she would come out at the last second and save me. I stared at the house for as long as I could, as the man dragged me further and further away. As I walked down the street, I wanted to cry, but I was still in shock and too scared to do anything. I didn't even know what I was supposed to do, so I sniffled and cried as the man tightened his grip and yelled at me. I can't even describe just how frightened and confused I was. We walked for a little while longer and ended up in the projects. It was a bunch of buildings crammed together in a very shitty neighborhood. We walked into one of the buildings and up a flight of stairs. My legs and feet were hurting like hell at this point, but I was still too scared to stop moving or complain. We climbed up another flight of stairs when I saw some random guy smoking a cigarette in the hallway. Then, without warning, the guy that had kidnapped me fell to the ground. It happened so fast. The next thing I remember, the man that was smoking the cigarette was punching and kicking the kidnapper in his head and his face. He then knocked him out cold. The cigarette guy picked up the kidnapper by the back of his jacket and threw him down the stairs. A little kid witnessing this kind of violence, an unconscious man being thrown down the stairs. To this day, I still have a fear of falling down the stairs. Once he hit the bottom, blood was everywhere. I still have no idea how the cigarette guy knew I needed help, but I'm glad he did. Maybe he saw the tears in my eyes. Maybe he just picked up on something and had a bad vibe. But he acted quickly. The cigarette guy was now pacing back and forth, swearing at himself, gritting his teeth, and clenching his fists. I thought maybe he was angry with me, so I started to cry. He then looked at me and said, Okay, shut up and stop crying. I wasn't as scared of the cigarette guy, but I still didn't want to test him. He began to ask me questions. Why are you out here this late? Where are your parents? And why would you talk to strangers? I was in so much shock and confusion, I couldn't answer his questions correctly. He then asked if I knew my way home, and I told him I didn't. In so many words, I tried to tell him about what happened, and somehow with the information I gave him, he knew where my mom's car was. I think he knew the area well enough to figure out where I needed to go. He told me he would take me back if I promised over and over that I wouldn't tell the police that I saw him or anyone that looked like him. This guy had an attitude, but I didn't care. I just wanted to go back to my mom, so I agreed. I followed him down the stairs. The bearded man was still lying on the floor, not moving at all. For all I knew, he was dead. The cigarette guy stepped over him, and I followed. He walked outside and nervously looked around. I remember him telling me, "The cops don't like me very much." He walked me out of the complex. He was going so fast that I basically had to jog to keep up with him. I started crying again, and he asked me what was wrong. I told him that my feet hurt, and I remember him sucking his teeth and begrudgingly picking me up and awkwardly carried me in his arms. We walked down the street for a while. I then remember him swearing and running behind a house as a cop car was driving down the road. He put me down and he told me to run to the police cruiser. I tried, but my legs could barely move and continued down the road before I could even remotely get close to it. The cigarette guy kept swearing under his breath as he picked me up again. He took me behind a lot of the houses and hid from every cop car that drove by. In retrospect, I assumed the police were looking for me. He carried me in both arms, running fast down the road. When I saw my mom at her car in the distance, she was surrounded by the police. The cigarette guy set me down and told me to run to where my mom was. Upon seeing her, I got so excited that the pain in my legs disappeared. I ran toward the police and my mother. She picked me up and hugged me tight. After I was reunited with her, the police began to ask me and my mother questions. I don't remember much about their questioning, but I do remember my mother telling them some convoluted story that didn't make any sense. She basically told me not to say anything, and being a kid, I didn't. I just sat there and cried. We went home after that. A few days later, my dad comes and picks me up. I told him everything. And after I did, I never stayed with my mom again. Looking back to that day as an adult, I never forgave my mom. Not long ago, I asked my dad what he remembers about the situation, and he told me what he thinks happened was that my mom was there to buy drugs, and I was kidnapped by somebody who just happened to be walking down the street. The person that saved me probably had warrants, and was not angry with me, but was just frustrated with the situation that he had to deal with. Imagine being a criminal on the run, and now you have to help a kidnapped girl after you just beat up her kidnapper and possibly killed him. If he would have gotten caught with me, he may have been charged for kidnapping. With my mom lying, and me being in shock and confused, I likely wouldn't have been able to tell the police that the cigarette guy was the one that helped me. Despite whatever crimes the cigarette guy committed in his past, he was the one that helped me that night. And for that, I'll be forever grateful. Up until I was in kindergarten, my mom used to put me in daycares or at neighbors' houses so that she and my father could go work. One summer, my mom asked this lady in our neighborhood to babysit me for the summer. I don't know what possessed my mom to choose this woman. Maybe it was out of desperation, maybe it was just pure stupidity. Perhaps a combination of both. But either way, my mother entrusted me with this woman for most of the day. This lady had no business being around children, let alone being responsible for one. I honestly believe that this woman was an alcoholic, mainly because she always looked sick and tired. Her eyes were always red, and her breath smelled like vomit every time she spoke. The worst thing, however, was that she was almost never around, basically leaving me unsupervised for hours. She would only ever be around when my mom dropped me off or picked me up. Otherwise, she was locked up in her bedroom. Once she had me clean her bedroom as a punishment for breaking a few of her picture frames, which I didn't. The moment I stepped inside, I saw several glass bottles strewn all over the floor. This lady had 2 nieces that were staying with her for the summer. I don't remember their names, nor if they were sisters or cousins, but I do remember their ages. The younger niece was around 8 years old, and the older niece was 11. They were the most horrible children I have ever met. The younger one was a disgusting, rude brat, and the older one was a manipulative liar and a complete sadist. When I first met them, I was friendly toward them. At first, they were friendly back. But things soon began to change. The older niece began to bully me, and the younger one soon joined in. At first it was name-calling, then it was teasing, then it was stealing, then blaming things on me. In just 1 week, things had escalated to the point where both nieces began to physically abuse me. The younger one liked to dump dirt and food on my head and pull on my hair. She would also steal my lunches. There was this one time she even peed on the floor and then blamed it on me, and I was the one who got in trouble. The older niece liked to throw glass bottles at me. She once put broken glass in my cereal and almost tricked me into eating it. When I asked her why she did that, she said that she wanted to see what would happen if I ate it. She would also push me into walls and furniture and drag me around by my hair. I couldn't fight her off because she was much bigger than me. Plus, the younger niece would join in and beat up on me as well. Every day I came home with bruises, cuts, and stuff in my hair. My nights were spent trying to pick out stuff from my skin, bandaging my cuts, and washing out whatever stuff was thrown on my head that day. My parents never noticed, not even the bruises and cuts that were on my face and arms. I also began to experience panic attacks at this point. Every morning, when I would wake up, I would cry hysterically, knowing that I would have to go to that house and be stuck with those 2 psychopaths all day. It was only then that my mother finally noticed that something was off. One morning, my mother asked me why I hated going to that house. I told her about how the girls were beating me up and throwing things in my hair. I showed her my cuts and bruises, as well as the burn marks from where they had set my ponytail on fire. My mother took off of work that day and drove to the house to confront the lady and her nieces. She showed the woman my bruises and cuts and demanded an explanation. The lady called her nieces over and had them tell my mother their side of the story. The nieces claimed that I was hurting myself and breaking things to get them into trouble. They didn't even know why I hated them so much, and that they still wanted to be my friends. Believe it or not, my mother believed them and got angry at me for lying. So she made me apologize to the nieces and the lady, then took me home and spanked me. From that day on, my mother just ignored whatever state I was in when she came to pick me up, no matter how badly bruised or cut up I was. All because she assumed that I was doing this for attention. So I continued to endure the endless abuse, and the nieces continued to get away with all of it. I wanted to leave in any way I could. I wanted my mom to believe me, but I knew I couldn't make her. The only thing I could do was nothing. So I began to zone out and basically became numb, eventually so numb that I practically felt nothing. By late summer, I had been subjected to this for 3 months. This was also around the time the lady set up a swimming pool. She decided to allow the 3 of us to use it, likely because she didn't want us to bother her anymore. So she asked my mom one morning if I could bring my bathing suit. My mom told the lady that I didn't know how to swim yet, so she wasn't sure if I should. The lady assured my mother that she would supervise me and make sure that I stayed in the shallow end. So the next day, my mom packed my bathing suit and brought me to the house. For once, I felt optimistic. The thought of swimming in a pool excited me, and I looked forward to it, even with the nieces there. When I got there, the lady told me to change into my suit and meet her and the nieces by the pool. When I got there, she laid out the rules before I went in. The lady told me to stay in the shallow end of the pool. She also told the girls that because I didn't know how to swim, I wasn't allowed near the deep end. She then went into the house to make a phone call, thus leaving me unattended. Once she was gone, the nieces walked to the deep end of the pool, but strangely, didn't jump in. Instead, they sat on the edge. I went to the shallow end and played by myself. Surprisingly, they left me alone for about 15 minutes. I was splashing in the water, blowing bubbles, and just having a good time. For the first time in weeks, I smiled and laughed. I was having so much fun that I forgot the nieces were still there. I then heard one of them calling out my name. The nieces decided to taunt me into going into the deep end. They kept saying that I was a big chicken for being afraid. I tried my best to ignore them and kept playing. But a few minutes later, I had enough, and I got out of the pool. I guess this didn't sit well with either of them, because as soon as I got out, the younger niece ran inside and locked me out. I ran to the glass door trying to get it open, while the younger niece stuck her tongue out at me from behind the glass. It was then that I felt 2 arms wrap around my head and shoulders. The older niece had come from behind and grabbed me. She started dragging me by the hair, away from the door, and toward the pool. The next thing I knew, I was tossed into the water. I panicked as soon as I realized that I was in the deep end. I tried desperately to stay above water, but I couldn't. The few times I did manage, I heard the girls laughing at me. The older niece then jumped in the pool, nearly landing on top of me. I felt her arms grab onto my head, pulling me down. I know this because my knees had scraped the bottom. I was flailing about, desperately trying to fight her off and get above the water. It wasn't until I felt my hand hit something that I was finally let go. By that point, we were both in the shallow end of the pool, so I managed to get my footing and my head above water. I surfaced to hear the sounds of the lady yelling and the older niece howling in pain. The lady charged into the water and yanked me. She pushed me into a chair and stared me down with her bloodshot eyes. "What the hell is wrong with you? I told your stupid ass not to go into that side of the pool. Now look what you've done." The lady then pointed at her older niece, who had blood running down her nose and was crying. Through coughs and tears, I tried telling her that the older niece had thrown me into the pool, but the lady wasn't having any of it. She demanded that I apologized for hitting her niece, but I refused and screamed, "No, I hate her." The lady soon got in my face and started yelling at me. She told me about how I was a stupid girl for not listening to the rules, and that had been nothing but trouble for both her and her nieces, and that my mother left me with her because she hated me. I screamed back at her, telling her that I wasn't stupid, and that her nieces were mean, that I hated being there so much, and I wish they would all die. The lady then flew into a rage and slapped me across the face. I was too shocked to even cry at that point. She then took the opportunity to tell me how wrong I was about her nieces, and what a horrible child I was. How dare I tattle on her nieces for my mistakes, trying to get them into trouble. How dare I not listen to her directions about the pool? How dare I attack her niece when she was trying to save me? How could I be so ungrateful when I owed my life to them, and that because of my behavior, I would never be welcomed at her house, ever again? The lady then stormed into the house and called my mom to come pick me up. When my mom got there, she apologized to both the lady and her nieces, then took me home. She was absolutely pissed. As soon as we got back, she immediately yelled at me for making her get into trouble with her boss, for having to take off work to come get me, and told my dad what happened. My father came home fuming, telling me that I shouldn't have been a brat. I was then grounded for a month. I haven't been to that house since this incident. I drive past that house on my way to work, and every time I see it, I get sick to my stomach. I have never told my parents about what truly happened that day. They'll probably dismiss it as kids just being kids, or me just being a brat. I have had years to think about it, and this creepy feeling always pops into my mind. I can't help but think that the older niece's plans of throwing me into the pool were on a far more sinister level than just bullying. I honestly believe that the older niece was trying to kill me, and that the younger niece was acting as a lookout for her. When the plan went south, the younger niece went to go fetch the lady, just so that she could get me into trouble for being in the deep end and hitting the older niece. I'll probably never know if that was the case, though it makes me shudder to think about what kind of adults those two girls grew up to be. I don't consider myself to be a hateful person, but I sincerely hope that lady's liver has failed her, and that the two nieces are rotting away in a prison cell or locked up in a mental institution. So about 5 years ago, I set out to travel the world. Being straight out of college left me in debt, desperate for any job, even if I was overqualified, and generally depressed. I felt isolated and alone in my small town in Washington, and found the only way to get out: travel. My high school buddy suggested I look into a volunteer group as a way to travel cheap, and so I did. The way it works is quite simple. You work for around 25 hours a week on some farm for food and housing. The draw is that since the community is made up of a bunch of cheap-ass travelers, it's a great way to meet new people, get outside of your comfort zone, and just let yourself live and figure life out. Fast forward 8 months, and I am a seasoned cowshit shoveler. I started out in Washington State and eventually moved south to California. There, I was able to save some money I was paid under the table for some extra work. It was now faced with a decision: where to go in the world. The excitement of being able to purchase a ticket to almost anywhere in the world got the best of me. And on the advice of my dumbass hippie volunteer partner, I went to a randomizer website and clicked the country button. Georgia, the country of Georgia. To say that I didn't know anything about it would be an understatement, but the fear of the unknown made it an exciting and exotic prospect. I purchased a ticket and started browsing a farm that would host me. There were few options. Most were remote and didn't even have internet connection. I messaged every single one because few ever responded. However, I did receive correspondence from one farm that was on top of a mountain. The picture showed a traditional Georgian stone house with a large garden out in the back, a family of several children, grandparents having dinner, animals. It seemed warm and inviting. The description was written in pretty good English, and the requirements for work seemed reasonable. I was excited. After I flew into Tbilisi, the capital, I followed the directions they sent to locate the farm, which was not an easy task. Few in Georgia speak English. The roads have not been maintained since the fall of the Soviet Union, and the country is generally poor. It took me around 20 hours of buses and taxis, weird serpentine roads and paths to get to that desired blue pin on my map. It was a dirt path leading up to a steep hill into a national park in the northern countryside. There was nothing for miles on end but trees and silence. As I got up that hill, I saw the house about a half a mile away on an even steeper hill, surrounded by trees. From that viewpoint, it seemed abandoned. As I walked past the gate, a man named Geary, who was apparently the owner, approached me. He was a heavy, small, middle-aged man with a big smile on his face. He reeked of alcohol. He shook my hand, then started showing me around the place. As he was showing me around, I noticed that there wasn't anyone there except for us. I asked about his wife and kids, and he brushed that aside and said something to the extent, "Don't worry about them, they're away right now." By this point, I am creeped out. From browsing around, it was apparent that this farm was in a deep decline. Apple trees and crops were dying. The roof of the small barn was caved in. The house itself was full of trash and smelling of mold. It was obvious that Geary was going through a rough patch, but I wasn't going to turn around and just leave in the middle of nowhere without a plan, having not slept for the past 36 hours. It was the evening time, and after feeding me well and trying the best he could to hold a conversation in English, Geary showed me to my room on the second floor, and I went to sleep. I almost immediately blacked out from the exhaustion and stress. I would have slept 10 hours if I wasn't awoken by a strange noise in the middle of the night. It sounded like something metallic and heavy was being dragged across the wooden floor. In that sleepy in-between state, I listened to it for a few minutes. I thought nothing of it and went back to sleep once it stopped. The next morning, Geary, who was now sober and agitated, asked me to repair some of the windows and doors in the house. He had planned to go fetch some components at a nearby village. Again, I got this creepy feeling down my spine. Something wasn't right here. He didn't maintain eye contact and was very evasive. There was no cell reception here and no internet. Once he left, I checked around the house to get a general idea of the place, and it became apparent to me that this place was hardly ever lived in. There was broken furniture, newspapers, and old photos on the floor, and a shattered mirror. I took out my phone and looked through the saved listing again. The photos didn't match either the backyard, the garden, or the walls. Gary wasn't in any of them. This was a completely different house. Now by this point, I am full-blown panicking. I pack my shit, and I start to leave when I see a group of 3 men going up that first hill. There were no other paths I could take, so I go behind the house and rush down the hill into the forest as fast as I could. After some time, I stopped and listened. I could hear them in the house. They were clearly looking for me. Afraid of making any noise, I remained still, hidden behind a bush. I don't know how long I waited there, but they were persistent. But at some point, I heard them leave. So I count until some large number and then proceed back into the house and eventually make my way back to that path. Once I find it, it's clear. I then booked it the hell out of there. I have never ran so fast in my life, but I was still in the middle of nowhere, with no traffic, no public transportation, nothing. I reached a paved road and began backtracking in the general direction I remembered coming from. Hours go by, and finally, a car drives by, then stops. Now, if this were a horror film, this would have been Gary and his friends, but this was actually a very nice Russian family that gave me a ride into town. The listing disappeared from the website a few days later, and I've never heard from Gary since. I've yet to make any sense of this experience. I have traveled since and volunteered as well. Some people, once they've heard the story, laugh and say that Gary was coming back over with a couple of friends from the village, maybe to have a chat over beers. Some say that he was going to kidnap and kill me, which was what my gut feeling was telling me. Something clearly was not right there, and if I didn't make the choices I did, I probably wouldn't still be alive. This happened on my 21st birthday. I'm 33 now, so this was 12 years ago. My friends and I decided to celebrate my birthday at our city's downtown area, where there's lots of fancy restaurants and bars to go to. Of course, this being my 21st birthday, I was obviously looking for a bit of excitement. When I was getting ready to go out, I received a text from my ex-boyfriend. This was not someone I wanted to hear from that night. He had been very abusive throughout our 5-year relationship. I was finally able to break it off shortly after our 5th anniversary, which was only a couple of months prior, so this was still pretty fresh. He didn't take it well when I told him that it was over. He even went as far as putting his hands on me. I regret to inform you that I didn't report the incident. It's one of my biggest mistakes. I never want anyone to experience this, but for those who have, you know that there's this magnetism that happens that keeps you trapped in a toxic cycle for a while, and you either make excuses or lie to yourself about what's happening. I guess this is why I never told anyone what was really going on. Anyways, back to the night in question. I know you might be thinking, why didn't you block his number? Here's the thing. I did. But he was so obsessive to the point where he would use these apps that gave out fake numbers that he would text or call me from. He used so many numbers that it was driving me insane, and no matter how many times I blocked him, he would always come back again. I was planning on changing my own number, but I hadn't got around to it at that point. Happy birthday, princess. I know you still miss me. Don't worry. We'll be together again soon. I know that you need time, but if I see you with anyone else, I'm going to be very upset. See you soon." I showed my friends the disturbing messages. They told me that he was trying to make me feel guilty for having fun by being vague and threatening. That didn't make me feel better, but I knew they were right. Once we were all ready, we headed out and began to celebrate at this fancy restaurant. We had a great time, and I finally felt free. Do any of you remember turning 21 and thinking to yourself that you have your whole life ahead of you? That's where I was at. Afterwards, we went to a nightclub to celebrate some more. During the entire celebration at both the restaurant and the club, I felt like someone was watching me. I initially dismissed it as paranoia because of the messages from my ex, but when we were at the club, sitting at the bar, having drinks, I saw the silhouette of someone on the other side of the dance floor. They were standing next to the fire exit, where it was very dark, so I couldn't make out any facial features, but I could tell they were staring directly at me. I thought I was going crazy, so I went back to talking and drinking with my friends, and of course, when I looked again, the mysterious figure was gone. By the time it was all over, it was around 2 a.m. My friends dropped me off at my house, and I had forgotten all about what happened at the club, but as soon as I began to look for my house keys in my bag, that dreadful feeling returned, and I felt like I was in danger. I scanned my surroundings. The house was dark, so I looked to the trees beside my front yard. I didn't see anything, but I felt like something was there, watching me. I know this sounds super mundane, but there is something terrifying about knowing something is there, but not seeing it. I'm sure everyone listening has experienced something like this at some point in their lives. I quickly found my keys, unlocked the door, and went inside. Once I was indoors, I felt safe and turned on a few lights. After staring out my window for about 30 minutes, I decided to head upstairs. Up to this point, I could have chalked everything up to me just being paranoid. I was on edge because my abusive ex-boyfriend decided to taunt me on my birthday, and it had me jumping at shadows. I had the feeling that someone was watching me. So what? That's not conclusive evidence that someone was actually watching me. As I said before, I felt like I was in danger, but I didn't actually see anyone outside of my house. And that person I saw at the club could have been anyone. Maybe they were just waiting for someone to get out of the bathroom. But if all this was just me being a nervous wreck, we still wouldn't be here. As I was heading up the stairs, I noticed that some of my clothes were lying on the hallway outside of my bedroom. For context, I lived alone at the time, and I'm not a messy person. I'm certainly not the type just to leave my clothes lying in the hallway. I knew right then and there, something was wrong. I don't know why, but I began to follow the trail of clothes leading up to my bedroom door. I froze. I just knew someone was in there, and I had a good idea who. I rushed downstairs and went outside to call my dad. To my surprise, he actually answered. "Hello? Dad, I think there's someone at my house." "What? Did you call the police?" "No, because I thought you would get here faster." My dad lived about 5 minutes from my house. I had every intention of calling the police, but there would be no guarantee they would arrive in time. "Okay, are you outside of your house now?" "Yes." "Stay out of sight, and I'll be there in a few." About 4 minutes later, I saw his truck pull in. After checking on me, he walked around the perimeter of the house, gun drawn. He saw no one. However, the back door was ajar. He then entered the house. After checking everywhere inside, he determined that whoever had been there was now gone. I was hiding by some bushes out front, so during the time that it took him to drive over, the intruder could have easily slipped out the back. My dad then made sure every door and window were locked and secured, and then offered me to stay at his place for the night. I thought about it, but I was extremely tired by then, and I wanted to sleep in my own bed. He did one last check before he left. A couple of minutes after settling in bed, I heard a crashing noise from downstairs. My stomach dropped as I heard the front door being unlocked. The intruder had smashed the door windows and reached through to unlock it. I quickly ran to my walk-in closet, but in my panic, I had forgotten my phone on the nightstand. It's too late now, I thought to myself as I heard footsteps coming up the stairs. I covered my mouth and began to cry. This could have been my last birthday if I didn't do something. So I began piling some clothes on top of me. They were already scattered around from when I threw them in there earlier. I knew it was futile. The intruder would instantly know I was hiding under the clothes if they opened the door. I remember seeing someone standing outside my closet door. I covered my mouth with my hands to stop myself from screaming. When I saw, it was my ex. Happy birthday to you, he said in a creepy sing-along voice before he kicked open the door and dragged me out by my legs. I began to kick and scream. I was not going to allow him to do something horrible to me, but he was much stronger than I and overpowered me. Stop struggling before you piss me off. I begged him not to hurt me and that I would do whatever he wanted. He then pointed to a hunting knife that was lying on my bed. Do you see that? That's my friend. His name is Joey. He wanted to get to know you inside and out, but I told him there's no fun in that. If you really want to get to know someone, you gotta take your time. He then picked up the knife. You do as you're told, or you're going to get to know Joey very well. He then led me downstairs and demanded that I cook him his favorite meal. If you think this situation sounds absolutely batshit insane, you're not alone. My ex had completely lost his mind. You should have seen the look in his eyes. I told him that I didn't have the ingredients and that he should go to the 24/7 mini-mart down the road. Do you think I'm fucking stupid? I'm not leaving you alone. Just make something and make it good. That's when we heard sirens from outside. Then we saw red and blue lights reflected in the windows out front. Damn it, not now. My ex bolted for the back door, but he was immediately met by a female police officer shouting at him to drop the knife and get on the ground. When I was escorted outside of my house, I saw that all of my neighbors were outside with shocked looks on their faces. I'm guessing one of them saw my ex breaking the window on the front door and called the police. I moved in with my dad shortly after that night. Unfortunately, my ex was bailed out months after he was arrested, which was something that stressed me out at the time, but he was convicted when he eventually had to go back to court. My dad suggested that I move out of state to live with my mom, but I never had a close relationship with her, so I decided to stay. We installed surveillance cameras and secured the house with an alarm. I have no idea where my ex-boyfriend went after serving his sentence, but I now have a family of my own with an overprotective husband. I have never felt safer, but from time to time, I still get that sinking feeling that someone is watching me from somewhere out of sight. Back when I was about 11 or 12, A friend and I were invited to a birthday sleepover. It was for a mutual friend of ours, and I remember that we were excited, as we had never been to this particular friend's house before. Her parents put an amazing amount of effort into this party. There was a buffet, barbecue, cake, and even a clown. The clown was kind of embarrassing for us. We thought we were too old for that kind of thing. But that was nothing compared to the birthday girl's father and his party games. The first one was to find a 50 piece that was hidden somewhere inside the house. During the game, he was chasing and shouting at us like a hyperactive child. Again, it was embarrassing, but the birthday girl seemed to be having a good time, so we pretended to be in the spirit of things. Next was the wish game. The birthday girl's father wanted us to sit on his knee and tell him a wish. I was very uncomfortable doing this, and I could tell that my friend was as well, but the birthday girl hopped on her dad's knee and told him her wishes. Before we knew it, he was looking at my friend, patting his lap. My friend put in a commendable effort to not look absolutely horrified, but looking back, there was no way in hell he could have thought she was okay with sitting on his knee. My friend is a girl, by the way. So she sits on his knee, mumbles her wish, and then it was my turn. I was a fool to think that I would get a pass just because I was a boy. No such luck. So he pats his knee again, looking at me. So I sit on his lap and told him my wish. Nothing sinister happened, but the whole thing put me and my friend on edge. After that was the cellar game. As soon as I heard him announce that, I thought, oh hell no, I am not going into a cellar with this creepy old man. And I could tell that my friend, who was on the verge of having a panic attack, was thinking the same. But then the dad rolls up a rug, revealing a trapdoor beneath it that led down to the cellar below the house. I actually changed my mind and thought this was kind of cool. After the fucking clown, the stupid find the coin game, and the pseudo-Santa cringe fest, the cellar seemed appealing. I am aware of how insane that sounds. So we all headed down into the cellar, and truth be told, it was pretty cool at first. The dad had a candle that provided the only light with the door closed. It was a small concrete room, and we sat on the floor while the dad told us some creepy stories. I got the feeling that these tales weren't age-appropriate, and our parents wouldn't have been happy about us listening to them, which made it even cooler. As he was getting ready for the big reveal part of the story, he blows out the candle, plunging us into absolute darkness. Everyone was laughing and shouting, but among the noise, I could hear that my friend actually sounded panicked. When we emerged from the cellar, I could see that my friend looked very upset. Before bedtime, I managed to catch her alone and ask her if she was alright. She told me, after the candle was blown out, I think her dad tried to tickle me, and then he kind of put his head into my neck. Please stay awake with me tonight. I promised that I would stay awake with her in case the dad tried something else. Later that night, my friend and the birthday girl had fallen asleep, and I wasn't far behind, but I promised to stay awake. I felt like it was my duty to stay awake and protect my friend. It turns out that my naivety paid off in this instance. I heard someone coming up the stairs, very slowly. The door slowly opens, and for a second, I thought it might have been an intruder, until the birthday girl's dad sticks his head into the room. After what felt like ages, he just stood there, watching us. He must have not noticed that I was awake. I'm lying there, watching him, as he watches my friend. He then walks into the room and over to my friend. I am completely freaking out, and despite feeling like a knight in shining armor just 10 minutes prior, I now had no idea what to do, and I could feel prickles behind my eyes. I didn't even realize that I was holding my breath until I let it go and made a loud exhale sound. The dad then looks my way. I remember his eyes going really wide, and he sort of scurried out of the room very fast. My heart was trip hammering, and I'm looking at my friend, wanting to wake her up, but I didn't though. And at some point, I must have fallen asleep myself, because when I woke up, it was morning. Needless to say, that was the first and last time we ever visited there. As of the writing of this story, I have been dealing with this situation for over 4 years. It all started in my last year of high school. I had gotten really into the hardcore scene from my city. I'm talking about hardcore punk, not the leather dungeon. Get your mind out of the gutter. I attended a bunch of local gigs with my best friend. One day I received a Facebook friend request from a guy named Alan. Looking at his profile and the stuff that he posted, I noticed he was about 3 years older than me, lived in the same city, and liked many of the same bands that I did. So 17-year-old me added him. We soon started chatting, mostly about bands and school. He was in the middle of getting a degree, and I was about to choose which one I would pursue. From time to time, he would tell me how pretty I was and asked if I had a boyfriend. I did find him to be attractive too, so I flirted back. However, I soon lost interest once I found out that he had a girlfriend, but they had been having some relationship problems. I didn't want to take part in any kind of cheating, so I just told him that he should think about what's best for him and his girlfriend, and do the right thing. From then on, I limited my chats with him to just music and school, and he too stopped flirting with me. A month or so passed without any kind of messaging, when suddenly I got a notification from him. We talked like we used to do, and just before I said goodbye, he told me that he had broken up with his girlfriend and felt so much better about life. He thanked me for always listening to him without judgment, and said that my advice had really helped him. I honestly didn't know too many details about his girlfriend, but he seemed to be glad to be done with the relationship, so I was happy for him too. Now at this point, I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was because I found him to be attractive, or because it was very late and I wasn't making the best decisions. But I told him that my best friend's birthday was in a couple of days and that he should come to the party too. He agreed in a second, and I told him to meet me at the bus station close to her house so I would finally get to meet him in person after almost half a year of talking online. I know what you might be thinking, and no, he wasn't a 50-year-old sexual predator. Although I must admit I should have been more careful since he could have been someone interested in harvesting my organs. Nevertheless, we met up. It was a bit awkward at first, since neither of us knew what to say, so we just walked to my friend's house, trying to make small talk. I guess we were both really nervous. Once we got there, things got better, and we actually had a good time. Although he pretty much only talked to me at the party. For the next month, we kept going out for casual dates, until he finally suggested that we become an official couple. This was where things began to get creepy. It hadn't been more than 3 weeks, and I was starting to feel anxious. I had this weird feeling that I used to have when I was a kid, when I knew that I was going to be punished for either getting bad grades or doing something bad in general. I just ignored it because I was no longer a child, and I wasn't doing anything wrong now. I just had this feeling whenever he was around me, What made it even more complicated was the fact that I didn't feel he had really changed. He wasn't rude or anything, but there was just something off about him. He would want to see me 24/7. We never went to his place, and whenever we were at my house, he would refuse to leave my room. He would spend hours just staring at me. I know you could all take this as a romantic gesture, but the way he looked at me didn't make me feel warm and fuzzy, but instead, shivery and anxious, like being in a room with Ted Bundy. I took the first chance he gave me to break up with him. He meant to text his ex-girlfriend some lyrics to a breakup love song, and instead sent them to me by accident. He apologized and explained that it was his way of letting her go, but I had none of it. I told him that we may have jumped into this relationship thing a bit too soon, and I thought it would be better if we went back to being friends. I had 37 missed calls that night. The next morning I had school. Sometime during that day, I got a text that instantly made me nervous. "What time will you be home? I'm coming over to talk." I really didn't want to see him that day, so I told him that I wasn't sure when I would be home, and that he shouldn't come over. Plus, we had only been dating for a couple of weeks, so why make a big deal out of it? I got home late that night, and guess who was standing by my front door? He had a blank stare on his face as he watched me pass by to park the car in the garage. I entered my house, shaking. It was like the thing from It Follows was standing just outside. My brother came to me asking me what the hell was going on. He said that Alan had been standing outside for over 4 hours now. I told him that I would deal with it, since he's my younger brother. I didn't want him to be involved. I took a deep breath and went outside. We argued for around an hour, in which he told me that he loved me and that he knew we were meant to be together. I told him that I wasn't feeling comfortable with him, and I just wanted to go back to being friends. He responded by telling me to move in with him. For a few moments, I was speechless. He used this time to explain how he would get a job and keep studying, and that I would finish school and then start my career as well. According to him, we would start a business together and have our first child by the time I was 21. He had our whole lives planned out, and I had no say-so in it. I managed to catch a moment during all this drivel and told him that he was straight up out of his mind. I was only 17 and nowhere close to even consider living with him, much less having a child. Alan then made this weird face, like he wanted to cry, but it was obviously fake. I don't even think he had the capacity to. And for those of you who have been paying close attention, will likely understand and know what Alan is. His behavior just creeped me out even more. I cut him off, told him that we were over, and ran back inside. From here on in, things only got worse. He would text my friends, even if they had no idea who he was, and would tell them that I needed to be with him, where I belonged. I blocked him from all social media since he was sending me non-stop messages. He would send me these bizarre poems that I would have found to be impressive if he wasn't such a creep. Staring at your bedroom window, a heartbroken man. You've decided I'm not the one, but I have a plan. You are the remedy. You are my cure. I wonder how much pain you can endure. The nights are long, I must admit. How I cannot wait to smell your scent. Alan was a truly disturbed individual. He resorted to calling my house, and if I picked up the phone, he would say, "You belong to me." And if anyone else answered the phone, he would just hang up. Now, this kept happening for almost half a year, And I know what you might be thinking. Why didn't you call the police and file a report? Well, I think now would be a good time to mention that this all took place in Mexico City. And I can promise you, no officer is going to take any action because of a few phone calls. I don't even think they would know what to do. Little by little, the phone calls stopped, but he was still texting me and dedicating songs to me on some radio station most people from the hardcore scene listen to. This one particular time, he dedicated a song called Your Betrayal by Bullet for My Valentine. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Alan would go from writing me love poems to insulting me and claiming that I ruined his life. I honestly lost count of how many disturbing things he did to me in these past 4 years. But I think the worst of them all was from a year ago, when I went to a show with my best friend. Beforehand, I was kind of flirting with one of the musicians that opened up for the headliner. The guy went to go get more beer. As soon as he walked away, 2 people sat down in the empty chairs in front of us. It was Alan and a girl he introduced as his sister. The moment we saw them, we froze. A mix of uncomfortable and terrified got to me, and I had to look away. Alan broke the silence, reaching for my bangs. "You cut your hair." I instinctively pulled back. "It looks good on you." "Everything does." He spoke in a soft but flat voice. I nodded and told him that I was with someone, so he should leave. I looked to his sister to encourage her to leave as well, but she was absent-mindedly playing with her phone. "Do you want a paper flower?" he asked, completely ignoring what I said before. The guy that I had been flirting with was making his way back, but when he saw that 2 other people were now sitting with us, he just drifted away. "Alan, seriously, you need to get going." I was now losing my patience, but I didn't want to make a scene, since the main show hadn't even started, and I wasn't the one who was going to be kicked out. Once again, he ignored me and started making a rose out of a napkin. Let's just go over here," my friend suggested, and we got up to leave. Alan's sister, who suddenly lost interest in her phone, was now grabbing me by the arm, keeping me from walking away. She didn't say a word. I tried to free myself, but before I could, Alan took one of my hands and put the paper flower in it. Only after that, his sister let go. Now, for what happened after this, I have to say 2 things. 1, I am known to be a bit too aggressive, but when it comes to people who I cared about at some point in my life, I have a soft spot. 2, Alan was beyond creepy, given that it had been around 3 years and he still wouldn't leave me alone. But he had never been violent with me. Both rules were broken that night. I snapped. I took the flower he gave me and slammed it against the table. "Alan, you're a creepy, disturbing weirdo who won't leave me the fuck alone. I don't owe you anything. Now get the fuck out of my life." I said this right to his face, with an anger I have never felt before. My friend and I then made our way outside for a smoke and to clear our heads. We were chatting, and I was visibly shaking as she was trying to calm me down, telling me that if I wanted to leave, it was okay. That's when we heard it. At first, it was some bottles falling, followed by someone screaming. At first, we thought someone had fallen down, but it didn't stop there. The yelling continued, and we saw a couple of bouncers at the entrance rush inside. I quickly put out the cigarette and headed toward the commotion with my friend. In all honesty, I was kinda hoping to see a bar fight. There were 2 tables knocked over, and I don't know how many beer bottles had been broken. A bunch of personal articles from a backpack were poured onto the floor. The one responsible for all this was Alan. Quickly, one of the bouncers restrained him, as another searched him for any weapons he may have on him. His sister was on the other side of the venue, screaming at Alan and the bouncers. I would like to tell you what she said, but she was incoherent. They literally dragged him out of the venue. I watched him kicking and screaming. This was the first time I had ever seen him get violent. When he saw me, he shouted, "See what you've done to me? You've ruined my fucking life." Since a small crowd had formed around him, people thought he was just on drugs and yelling nonsense. My eyes started to fill with tears. Maybe it was because I was so frightened, or because I still didn't fully understand what was going on. What could I have possibly done to him to make him like this? Thankfully, my friend found me among the crowd, and without even asking, she dragged me to the subway to head back home. I haven't seen him since that night, but I know he's still around. I now live in Japan. I moved here shortly after that last incident. It was my birthday just a few months ago, and I received a big bouquet of red roses with a card that read, "They're not paper this time. Happy birthday. Yours truly, Alan." I live in a small town in South Africa. Near my hometown is a large patch of woods that I hadn't been to since the COVID outbreak, until yesterday. My friend called to ask if I wanted to join him and a few others to play a game of paintball. I was down. I grabbed my gear and headed out. There were 6 of us total. I want to give a quick shout out to my people: Chase, Liam, Matt, Joey, Steven, and yours truly. We got in our cars and set out to the forest, but made a few stops on the way there to fill up on petrol. When we finally got there, we parked our cars, got our gear on, separated out the forest green and dark brown armbands. We used colors that blend into the forest terrain. Once the teams were chosen, we locked and loaded and ventured out. Team Alpha and Team Bravo. Once we got to the perfect spot, we played a couple of games of Capture the Flag. Since it was winter, it got dark quickly, but we had prepared for this and brought along our flashlights. No night vision, unfortunately. Sorry if that disappoints any military listening in. We played a couple of night games, which was extremely difficult. Friendly fire was a factor. During the last match, Joey and I decided to sit out because we were both pretty tired and just needed a breather while the others continued to play a good distance away from us. While we were sitting there freezing, I was rolling up a joint. Yeah, I smoke pot. Joey got up to take a piss. I had the flashlight pointed toward myself, since there was no other light source to allow me to see what I was doing. It was so dark that I couldn't even see 2 meters ahead of me. Suddenly, I heard footsteps coming my way. Of course, I thought it was Joey returning from his nature call, but I soon realized I couldn't see his flashlight. I became more alert, but still relaxed, thinking he might be trying to play a prank on me or something. The footsteps stopped just a few meters away from me. I raised my flashlight and scanned the area, but just saw nothing but bushes and trees. I just thought Joey might be hiding somewhere in the overgrowth, waiting to give me a jump scare. I then heard footsteps coming in the opposite direction. I could see that this time, it was Joey. Whoever was approaching me before wasn't Joey. I grabbed my paintball gun, and when Joey came within earshot, I whispered, "Bro, I think there's someone hiding over there." Joey thought I was messing around and just said, "Stop being a baby." However, he soon regretted saying that, because I did one last scan of where I heard the footsteps, and to my horror, I saw someone peeking out, staring right at me from behind a tree, probably 10 or 11 meters away from us. I jumped back and said, "What the actual fuck?" Joey saw the person too, and instantly jumped up, picking up his paintball gun as well. We stared at each other for at least 2 minutes until the man stepped out from behind the tree. He was a large guy, at least 6 feet. He was filthy, like he hadn't showered in years. He was wearing baggy, ripped-up jeans and an old, dirty bomber jacket. He was clearly on something, and he was holding something behind his back. He finally spoke up. "What are you guys doing out here in the dark?" We couldn't even answer him because we were still in shock. "We were just leaving," Joey stuttered. The man shook his head and said, "No, you're not. Your friends are still over there." I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. "How about we play a game of our own while we wait for your friends?" That's when he finally revealed to us what he was hiding behind his back. It was a large machete. That's when I knew we had to get the hell out of there. So I aimed my paintball gun, and I told him in my tough guy voice, "Leave now, or I will shoot." I only had about 6 or 7 paintballs loaded. Joey did the exact same thing, even though he had no paintballs left. The man didn't flinch. He just smiled and said, "The game starts now." He then rushed at us. I shouted at Joey to run, while I fired my last paintballs at the machete-wielding lunatic. I don't know if any of you have ever been paintballing, but being hit by one is quite painful, especially without any gear on. It feels like a bee sting or being snapped with a wet towel. So when I shot him in his head, it caused him to fall, and that was our chance to haul ass. As soon as we started running, we heard the footsteps again, and he was actually gaining on us. We could barely see where we were going, but we couldn't afford to slow down. After a few more moments, we heard other paintball guns being fired. It was the game that was still going on between our friends. Joey began shouting to get everyone's attention, but tripped over something and twisted his ankle in the process. I turned around to help him, and when I did, I could see the man running full sprint toward us. In that moment, I thought it was going to be the end for us, but our friends had heard Joey shouting, and both Team Alpha and Bravo rushed in and opened fire on the South African Jason Voorhees. No matter how tweaked out he wasn't going to be able to take all those paintballs at once. He decided to turn around and retreat back into the forest. We all helped Joey up, gathered our belongings, and rushed back to the cars. When we got to my friend's place, we treated Joey's ankle, while I explained to my friends everything that happened. The entire situation was insane. It's safe to say that if I ever go back to those woods, I'll have to be more vigilant. I just hope that vagrant we encountered was just some homeless guy wandering around in the woods and not part of some drug operation. Hey Uncle Unit, as soon as I saw your post that you were looking for paintball-related horror stories, I instantly thought about something that happened to me in 1999. When I tell this story to people who weren't there that day, they think I'm completely making it up. And if I heard this from someone else, I'd probably think they were full of shit too. But I don't know what I can say to assure everyone that this actually happened. And in hindsight, it's more of a comedy than a horror story. But I'll just go ahead and explain what happened, and the audience can make of it what they will. I was 19 years old back then, living in a part of California where paintballing was very popular. My hometown had 2 paintballing arenas that would compete with each other for the market. Every once in a while you could get these killer markdowns on equipment rentals and time slots. Maybe if you were involved in the scene back in those days, you'll know where I'm talking about. The owner of the field we went to that day was a huge Anaheim Ducks fan. Anyways, it was a buddy's birthday, and of course we got the guys together and set up a death match, getting a crazy markdown price for it. We selected our teams, geared up, and took our positions on the field. Most of the field was a wide open plain with your typical bunkers and wooden obstacles set up all around. It was especially designed for death matches. However, there was a section that was about an acre wide that was a small forest. The last man standing of a losing team would often retreat to this area to give themselves a fighting chance. My teammates wanted me to take position in this area since it was on our side of the field. The two of them thought they would make quick work of the others, and I could take care of anyone who retreated to the forest. So I set up behind a fallen tree and waited for the horn to sound off. Shortly after the match began, I heard something moving around in the bushes a few yards away from my position. I stood up for some reason. My tactical awareness wasn't up to par back then, obviously, but I pointed my gun toward the commotion, not saying anything. A deer head then appeared out from the leaves, and at first, I wondered how a deer got onto the field since a large fence surrounded the property. But what happened next is the stuff of legends. It wasn't a deer head, it was a deer mask, and the person wearing it stood up and walked out from the bushes and stood before me. The guy was only wearing a deer mask, and I had a full view of the meat factory. Yes, a naked man wearing a deer mask was hiding behind some bushes and was now just standing there, completely exposed. I did the only thing I could think of. I shot the guy right in the dick, and he immediately hunched over, grabbing his groin, and bellowed in pain. I then booked it back out to the main field, where I was immediately pelted by 3 members of the opposing team. After I got done shouting at them for shooting me, I told them that there was a naked guy hiding in the woods. After I got done explaining myself and trying to convince them that this wasn't some elaborate prank, I called out to my other teammates after an official timeout was called. All 6 of us teamed up and went to investigate the forest area. Like with a lot of these stories, by the time we got there, the perpetrator had disappeared. However, luckily for me, the deer mask had been left behind, and my teammates vouched for me that I didn't have this on me when we departed to take our positions for the death match. We told the owner what happened and gave him the mask. He said there had been some break-ins happening on both his property and the other paintball arena. But this was the first time he heard anything about a nudist in an animal mask. He said that he would report the incident to the police and offered us a refund. But hell no, we weren't going to allow some sex cult deviant to ruin our death match. So I changed out my fatigues, and we had a do-over, and ended up losing, but we had a lot of fun. It's a funny story looking back on it, but in the moment, I was genuinely terrified. I grew up in a suburb of Raleigh, North Carolina, which has a virtually non-existent crime rate. My father and I moved there when I was 6, and he was always busy, so I pretty much had to raise myself. Shout out to anyone else who was brought up in a similar situation. So naturally, I would attend school there, and I made all of my lifelong relationships there, so on and so forth. The year was 2008, my senior year. I had a very close-knit group of friends, primarily made up of people I had known since middle school. One such friend had recently come back from Holly Hill, which was our local mental hospital, after a serious self-harm incident. His name was Matt. He had been gone for a couple of weeks when I saw him in the common area at our school before heading to class, and fortunately I didn't really have time to talk, so all I said to him was, "Welcome back, man. We missed you." I would have risked being late for class if I had known that would be the last thing I would ever say to him. Matt had suffered from a multitude of mental issues, but he kept a pretty good rap on the details, so none of us really knew how severe it was until the aforementioned incident. One of our mutual friends messaged me on Facebook, asking me if I would like to go paintballing with them on the night of November 30th. I had to turn them down because I had to go see my grandparents the next morning for a late Thanksgiving celebration. It wasn't a big deal, just kind of a disappointment. The break came and went, and I eventually went back to school. Matt was absent again. There had been rumors floating around that he had run away from home and had gone back to Washington, D.C. to look for his birth mother, but I wasn't sure if I believed that. He wouldn't go off on a long-term trip without at least mentioning it to someone from school. In between switching classes, I called his cell phone, which went straight to voicemail. I didn't think much of it. A few days later, there was a buzz around school that Allegra, the mutual friend who had asked me to go paintballing, and Adil, someone else who I was acquainted with, had both been taken out of class and arrested. We had no idea what happened, but had a strange feeling that it had something to do with Matt's absence. After that, all I could really think about was where Matt was, and the fact that Allegra sat right behind me in drama class. The school tried to keep everything quiet in regards to the students theorizing and talking to one another about what happened. But it was high school, and word travels fast. When we weren't talking about it, we were texting each other. Our local news website reported that 4 of Matt's friends had been arrested in connection with a body found in Allegra's parents' summer home. And of course, it was Matt. 2 years later, Allegra, Adil, and 2 other people from Matt's circle of friends went on trial for murder. Allegra received 2 consecutive 20-year terms for conspiracy to commit murder and murder in the second degree. Adil received the same sentence. The other 2 involved in the trial received life sentences for first-degree murder and accessory after the fact. I was floored. All of this is available online if anyone wants to learn more about it. There's a lot more details than what I care to mention here. But they murdered him on the night of November 30th, the same night they asked me to come paintballing with them. There was a period of time that I kicked myself for not going that night. I like to think that I would have had some, if not a little, influence in stopping what happened. But realistically, I probably would have ended up right next to him. I'm 19, and I live on a farm in a rural area with just my mom and older sister. There are no houses around us, just long stretches of fields and open land. Usually I go out back and do most of the work around the farm myself, while my mother handles the business side of things. My sister works in the city and has an office job. She usually gets home pretty late. One night I was outside fixing the porch light when my sister pulls into the driveway. Going by how late it was and the fact that she looked exhausted, I figured that she had had a tough day at work. But when I went inside the house, I found her talking to Mom in a low, hushed tone. I asked what happened, and my sister explained to me that there was a car following her on her way back home. This car had apparently been following her all week. She said that they would usually tailgate her for a short while and then turn away, but this time, they were tailing her almost the entire way. She took a bunch of wrong turns to lose them, which is why she was so late that night. My mom advised her to inform the police, and I supported that. My sister is capable and all, but she's also too friendly sometimes, and has frequently found herself in situations with creepy individuals. All of her ex-boyfriends have turned out to be assholes or stalkers. She's just too trusting of people at times. Unfortunately, she forgot to copy down the license plate number of the car, so she just gave the police a description of it. It was a light blue sedan, one of the older models. They told her to call it in if she noticed the car again, and that was all that could be done for now. A couple of days went by, and nothing happened. The car had apparently stopped following her. However, a package was delivered to our front doorstep. It wasn't something from UPS or the Postal Service. It was a shoebox. I saw it first when I was heading out to do work on the farm. I opened it to find a video cassette. I popped it into our old VCR. It turns out it was surveillance footage of the front of our house. It started when my sister left for work and stops when she returned home. There was a cut in between, otherwise it would have been over 8 hours of footage. I showed my sister when she woke up. She claimed that this was filmed the day before she called the police about the tailgater, going by the weather and the clothing she had on in the video. Obviously, we were all freaked out. She and my mom stayed inside, while I went out to check out the spot where the video had been recorded from. The vantage point was pretty far away from my house. I could only make a guess that it was from somewhere by the edge of the front pasture, but there was no trace of a camera or tripod. Since it was raining the day this video was recorded, any markings in the dirt or footprints had been washed away. We contacted the police again, and they asked her to bring in the tape. They said they couldn't do anything because there was no direct threat, only an implied one, and we also couldn't prove that it had been recorded on our property. The person who sent in this tape was clearly doing it to taunt us. As of the writing of this story, another tape showed up on our doorstep yesterday, depicting the same thing. I'm a female, and I was 20 years old when this happened. At the time, I was a junior in college. I transferred from a local community college to a university a few hours away. Due to a communication issue with the admissions office, I had a very short amount of time to find a living accommodation. I didn't know the area, and I had to resort to looking at Craigslist ads for a room to rent. Thankfully, I found a place near my school and met up with the guy who was renting out the room. It was a large house in a very nice neighborhood. The man's name was Peter. He was in his early 30s, worked mostly from home, and was very polite. Peter also rented out a room to another university student who was out of town until the semester began. When I eventually met the other roommate, he was mostly quiet and kept to himself for the most part. For my first week, I was completely alone in the house. Peter was out of town on a business trip, and the roommate had not returned from his parents' place yet. Not gonna lie, being alone in the house was a bit eerie. It was so large and mostly unfurnished, aside from a couch and a television set in the living room. There was a locked upstairs level that you could only access from an outdoor staircase that was directly outside of my bedroom. The house seemed to have several additions, so the layout was a bit odd. My bedroom was very spacious and had visible wiring throughout the room. The closet had a broken door that was propped up to the side. Peter told me that the previous owners had used it as an office. I checked out the wiring because it gave me a bad feeling, but I didn't find anything suspicious about them, mostly because I had no idea what to look for. Once Peter returned, I noticed a few odd things about him. He would say strange things to me that were vaguely sexual. He also liked to take pictures of me without my consent and post them to Facebook, usually tagging me in them. At first, the pictures were very mundane, such as me sitting on the couch or typing on my laptop at the kitchen table. He would turn the flash off, so I never knew when he was taking these photos. Until I saw them online later, the pictures became more invasive over time. There was one of me in a towel when I was in the hallway walking from my bathroom to the bedroom. Another was of me tanning in the backyard. At the time, I didn't know he was home. I found Peter to be strange, and I was uncomfortable around him. But the room was a steal, and the location was good for my school. The other roommate shared a thermostat with me. It controlled my bedroom, his bedroom, and the hallway that led out to the living room. It was located in my bedroom, so I always left the door unlocked for him to change it if needed. One day, when Peter was out of town, the roommate was adjusting the thermostat when he noticed something strange behind one of the wires in my closet. He called me over to inspect it. It looked like a tiny black ball. I didn't know for sure, but it looked like it could be a small camera. So I put a piece of tape over it and considered calling Peter, but I didn't want to accuse him of something that I didn't know was true. So the roommate and I decided that we would ask him together when he returned from his trip. 2 nights later, I woke up from a deep sleep. I was disoriented, but I noticed my bedroom door was open, and someone was moving around inside my closet. I stayed very still and tried to make out who the figure was. As I mentioned, I thought it might have been my roommate adjusting the thermostat, but my eyes had not adapted to the darkness yet. But I could clearly see someone moving from the closet to the open door. The figure left, and I turned on the light to inspect my closet. I saw that the piece of tape that I had placed there 2 nights ago was now missing. I then opened my door and saw Peter walking down the hallway back to his bedroom. I quietly followed him, and after he opened his bedroom door, I confronted him, demanding to know what the hell he was doing in my bedroom in the middle of the night. He jumped when he saw me. He was obviously taken off guard. Behind him on his laptop computer was a grainy video feed of my bedroom, where I could clearly see that my bed was in the frame. Although Peter was a creepy man, he wasn't the confrontational type, and he immediately began apologizing and trying to explain that this wasn't what it looked like. Unfortunately, there was nothing I could do since it was his property, but I covered the camera back up and moved out as quickly as I could. I did file a police report, but I don't want to get into that too much since the case is technically still open, but I finally wanted to get this experience off my chest. I'm not sure how much footage Peter has of me, or if he's posted it somewhere online, or if he ever captured anything worthy of being posted, other than maybe a few nude shots. The other roommate moved out around the same time I did, and the last time I drove by that house was a few months ago, and there was a foreclosure sign in the front yard. I'm a police officer who works in a major city in Australia. I'd rather not say which one. This whole experience started this past Monday, when I was working my station's front desk. Our command is in a pretty rough area, so even around lunchtime on a weekday, the place is packed. Most of the people in the lobby were there to report on bail, and that demographic tends to look how you would imagine. But there was one woman who stood out among the rest. It wasn't just her lack of face tattoos, it was because she appeared to be very nervous. When it got to her turn, the first thing she said was, "I might need to talk to a detective." That's usually a pretty good icebreaker in this profession, and my notebook was out right away. I explained that she could talk to me first, and that I would see what I could do. Cops over here are a bit less jumpy about people pulling black objects out of their bags than they are in the States. Let's not get political, I'm just stating facts. However, I was still surprised when the woman pulled out a VHS tape from her bag and slid it underneath the glass. It took a few minutes for me to get the full story out of her, because she seemed to go back and forth between being utterly horrified, then embarrassed, and kept apologizing for wasting police resources on what she said was probably nothing. Basically, she told me that a couple of months ago, she had been jogging around her area when she passed a whole bunch of furniture and personal items sitting by the sidewalk outside of a house. Judging by how much stuff there was, she assumed it was actually there waiting for a disposal company, and she decided to pick through it and saw a box with a VCR in it. She came back later in her car and took it home. She was going to check to see if it worked and try to flip it on eBay. It ended up sitting on her shelf for 2 months before she finally got around to testing it out. She bought a random tape from a thrift store, but when she tried to insert it, she discovered there was already a tape left inside. I thought it was stupid that she would run out and buy a tape without at least checking the VCR first. I took her into one of the interrogation rooms and had a staff member wheel in one of the TV carts. Some of our training videos for new recruits haven't been updated since the 1980s, and we still showed them on VHS. So we sat down and watched what was on the tape. It was labeled SEC Camera Club. It began with a woman tied to a chair inside of a room. The camera's POV walked around her before coming uncomfortably close to the woman's face. You could hear the camera operator panting heavily throughout the film. Soon, the tied-up woman began begging for her life. The woman who was sitting next to me in the interrogation room, whose name was Jennifer, asked if she could step out into the hall before the next part. I granted her request. What was depicted next still makes me feel sick just thinking about it. There's a chance it could have been fake, but by the way it was shot and the terrified look on the tied-up woman's face, it seemed real to me in the moment. The cameraman pulled out a knife, and you can guess what happened next. The screams I heard on that tape still haunt me. I was shocked. I must have looked like an idiot because I had no idea what to tell her when I came back out into the hallway. In the end, I wheeled the TV into my sergeant's office, and he basically laughed in my face and said that this was all fake. He had been a cop for 13 years and had been to dozens of stabbings, and there was never that much blood. The cranky bastard then got pissed off at me that I had spent so much time watching a horror film when the lobby was still full of people. Even before the pandemic, the sergeant didn't like too many customers waiting around the station. I relayed what my sergeant told me to Jennifer. She was both relieved and embarrassed. I tried to give her the tape back, but she recoiled and told me to chuck it out for her. She didn't want it. I've been doing some independent research on what could have been on the tape. The only thing I can compare it to is a 1978 horror film called Faces of Death. It's a film that is presented as if it were an actual documentary, presenting the viewer with disturbing footage that depicts various ways of dying. The film is tame by today's standards, but was very shocking for its time because of the realistic nature of its presentation. Fair warning, if you love animals, do not look up that film. Now, to be clear, it wasn't a scene from Faces of Death, but I'm wondering if it's something from a similar production. Referring back to my notes from that day, the video was well lit, and the woman and the killer were wearing normal clothing. The walls of the room looked like corrugated iron, perhaps from a shed or maybe a barn. Has anyone ever heard of the SEC Camera Club? There were no serial numbers on the videotape, and my Google searches have failed to unearth any further information regarding this. I'm assuming it must have been from some underground bootlegging company that specialized in selling exploitation films. Or maybe it was a group of amateur filmmakers trying to make this look as real as possible. I'm just guessing here, and I know this is all very scant information to go off of. But if you know anything about this, please leave a comment below.